welcome. It's great to see such a collection of Texans and others here tonight. I think there's is there an election going on this year? My name is Jim Hollifield, and I just came back from Washington, D.C. about a month ago, where I've spent a year on sabbatical. But it's great to be back in Texas, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for this program. I see we've got a great group of people from all different parts of the community, faculty, students, and those coming, especially those of you who are coming from outside of SMU. As the director of the Tower Center, I want to encourage all of you who are not members of the center to look at it, go on the website, join us, and take full advantage of the things that we have to offer here at SMU. The Tower Center is Center for Public and International Affairs, and we do many programs. Tonight, we're very lucky to have a program that's really going to talk to us about what's happening in American politics. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Hiroki Takeuchi Sensei, with whom I have had the pleasure of working for many years. We have a pretty strong Japanese contingent here tonight, I think, through the Japan-America Society. He's going to introduce the speaker and the program and tell you how all this is going to unfold. So let's welcome to the podium Takeuchi Sensei.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to the third of the 4 events this week at the Tower Center. And so before starting, I'd like to acknowledge 2 staff members here who made these events possible, Gora Lassi and Kari Hansen. Please join me for thanking them. So I'm Hiroki Takeuchi, the director of the Soundstar program on Japan and East Asia in the Tower Center. This is the 20th year anniversary of the establishment of the Soundstar program and Soundstar Fund, which was established in 1996. And to celebrate the 20th year anniversary, this summer in June, we had a symposium, Soundstar Symposium, in Japan with the collaboration of the Global Security Institute of Keio University. And we did that conference in the Keio University's Mita campus. By the way, I'm originally from, I'm an alumni of the Keio University. So the theme was the US-Japan relationship, and everybody basically was concerned with American politics. It motivates me to organize the 2 events regarding American politics. And 2 weeks ago, some of you, I think, attended. Thank you very much. 2 weeks ago, we had an event on American foreign policy featuring Dr. Ken Schultz at Stanford University. And this is the second event. And then today, we are going to talk about American domestic politics. And today, we have the best person to talk about what's going on in American politics right now. Basically, Donald Trump is challenging civility, as well as arguing for racism, protectionism, and xenophobia. Today we have Dr. Skip Lupia from University of Michigan, who has been studying the voting behavior for a long time in his career. He is a political psychologist, and Dr. Lupia is Hal R professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. Previously, he was teaching at UC San Diego, and he was PhD from Caltech. He was PhD from all the social sciences from California Institute of Technology. And he has a BA of economics from University of Rochester. And speaking of University of Rochester, we have a colleague, Dr. Harold Stanley, who is a vice president of SMU. And then more importantly for this event, he is a co-sponsor. His institution, Green Pettus program, today co-sponsors this program. So please join me for thanking Dr. Hal Stanley and the Green Pettus program. Also, for the reason of this program is originally motivated by our symposium in Japan. We asked Japan Society Dallas Fort Worth to advertise this event, and when I asked them to advertise this event, they asked me how we should justify the advertisement in the Japan Society. So what I'm saying is what I said was actually understanding what's going on in current American domestic politics is very important to understand US-Japan relationship. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Lupia more formally. So Dr. Lupia is Dr. Lupia gave ECL the solar pole lecture in American Political Science Association a few years ago. And I'd like to go with the introduction of him in that lecture. Some of the quotations. It introduced him as Professor Lupia truly captures a range of scholarship nearly unparalleled in the discipline. While he may be best known for his widely cited and influential work on information and public opinion formation, he also has made fundamental contributions to the study of institutions, comparative politics, and methodology, especially experiments and surveys. He has received the National Academy of Sciences Award for initiatives in research, and then he is the only political scientist ever won the award. And then here is go on and on. So I will not talk about everything that was mentioned in that introduction. So he combines the logical rigor of formal models with the empirical realism of psychologically oriented work. And in the lecture, he said, the reason to believe a scientist's claim is not because they wear a lab coat, have a PhD, or have published a widely viewed paper in the past. But the credibility of scientific claims comes from the fact that their meaning is available for other scholars to rigorously evaluate. So he has really raised the standard of scientific research of politics and society. So since I met him, just after I had completed my dissertation several years ago. His work has been always stimulating. And then since then, I have felt that as if he asked me challenging questions, and he has guided me toward a better understanding of politics and society by making my research scientifically rigorous. Although I do not think that I have been able to meet the standard he has set, my efforts to meet it has laid the foundation of my research. So I really appreciate Dr. Lupia, and then I'm very delighted to have Dr. Lupia today. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Lupia.
Thank you, Takeuchi-sensei. Thank you, Takeuchi-san. So it's a great privilege for me to be here. Thank you for making the time to come out here. This is my second visit to SMU. My first visit was in 1981. The microphone wasn't working then either. My father, my parents got divorced when I was very young. So growing up, I spent the winters outside of Buffalo, New York, and I spent the summers in El Paso, Texas. And my father, my father was really keen on having me go to a Texas university. So we drove by UTEP, but the first university we visited on that trip was SMU. We came to SMU, and it was great. I remember the campus being so beautiful. We went to TCU, we went to Rice and Baylor. I saw the bear drink Dr. Pepper. It was really memorable. Went to UT. It was a great trip. Somebody asked me this morning, well, why didn't you come here? I grew up on a farm outside. During the year, there's a farm outside of Buffalo, and we didn't have cable at the time. We didn't have the internet. Texas was a little culture shock for me. It was like, I love it, but it was hard. So I went to University of Rochester, funny enough, with Harold and Wild. But I love being back here. So I want to talk a little bit about voters and how people are thinking about elections. I want to leave time for some questions. There's a book that I've written, and we'll talk about it, but I really want to just have a conversation about really what's going on. I study two things, primarily. One is how people make decisions when they don't know very much. And fortunately, that's pretty much all the time. So, particularly in politics. So I like that. And the other thing I get to do is study how to convey complex ideas to diverse audiences. Where by diverse, I mean people just have different backgrounds and different beliefs. And how do you take something that's kind of complicated and say it in a way that everybody's like, oh, I kind of get that. As opposed to have half the people think you're talking about apples and half the people think you're talking about elephants, right? So those are the things I get to work on. Now, my origin in doing this is a little complicated. The route I took was a little strange. My background is really in mathematics, so these are actual images of things that I have published that other people have read. In fact, there are about 10 people in the world who can read this. But because of where I grew up, because of how I grew up, I think of my life as devoted to service, right? And my mom kind of cares how smart I am, but nobody else really does. So that's not relevant. So the question is, how can I take? So I think of math as plumbing. That's how I think of it. It helps you put some things together. It helps you think about, plumbing is pretty basic. I know how to do it now, but it's really important that the pipes meet at exactly the right point, or else you have water everywhere. Math kind of helps you do that with ideas. It helps you do which things go together and which don't. So that's how I use it, and I use it to try and help people make better decisions. So in my life today, I help organizations around the world try to convey complicated ideas more effectively. I have leadership positions with the National Academy of Sciences, with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They make Science Magazine, NSF. Spend a lot of time in Washington helping people communicate more effectively. But I also do work in politics. Okay, so I don't do partisan work myself, but I have friends on both sides. So here's my disclosure: I am bilingual. I am fluent in Democrat and Republican because I've been interviewing people for 25 years and running surveys, running experiments, and things like that. And part of my job is really to listen to people on their own terms. On their own terms, like how are they seeing the world? What are they anxious about? What are their goals? And then trying to figure out how to help someone who if I know something that's of use to you, how do I relate it to your life? Because ultimately, if I can take information and relate it to your life, you're going to be more interested in it. And that's the key to so much communication. So I have friends on both sides. They call me. I take calls. I have worked on a campaign this year, but it's not one in this country. I'm happy to talk about it. As you may know, in the country of Colombia, there has been a 50-year insurrection. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been displaced. There is a peace agreement that has now been arranged. There will be a referendum on it in 2 weeks. I have helped the government with its referendum strategy on how to talk about it, how to launch it, how to try and make peace a reality there. So I'm happy to do that. And I have, again, lots of friends on both sides. I'm happy to tell you what I can about my conversations with them. But what I want to do now is move away from this and talk about how people make decisions, right, in elections and how they learn about it. So let's start with the idea of voting, and let's start with this young lady right here. And she's trying to figure out what's going on, because it's been a heck of a campaign, hasn't it? There's all kinds of unexpected twists and turns, and lots of people saying things you haven't heard before. And so how do you deal with it? How does she deal with it? And so that's what we'll talk about. And I just want to reduce our conversation to 4 questions, right? So the first question is, why are so few voters fully informed? Right? Well, we think there's an ideal of what people should know in politics. It's why do so many people seem to know so little? So we'll talk about that first. And then second, we'll say, well, how much does a voter actually need to know? If you can't, if you don't know enough, how much do you need to know? And then we'll move to another question, which is how do voters learn? Like, if you're really interested in people being more educated about politics, how do they learn? Or not, right? And so you may have noticed that the title of this talk is, I'll see it when I believe it. And that's a lot of what this is about. We have this is the inversion of a common saying. And a lot of how we learn is we'll see it, we'll be able to hear it when it's consistent with our values. And so much of politics is about the conflict of values, about people who have different values in this country. And so sometimes what someone can hear is largely influenced by the values that they have. It's almost like having a particular set of prescription lenses that lets some things get through and others not. But that's part of reality, and we'll talk through how that works. Right? And so the final question, and this is for everybody, but mostly for the young people in the room, is should I be cynical? Because there's a lot of complaints and consternation about the campaigns. And should I be cynical? So I'm going to let you decide the answer to that question, but I hope I'll give an argument that will make you think a little differently about it. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Why are so few voters fully informed? And those of you who I saw in class this morning, the next couple minutes are going to be refreshing. So, when some people look at this picture, they see this gentleman, the point is not working, but a lot of them see the folks back here. And if you don't prefer this gentleman, you say, what on earth are these people thinking? Right? And then there's this picture, and a lot of you know Secretary, and some people look at her, but some people look at the folks back here, and if you don't prefer this candidate, they say, what on earth are those people thinking? Right? So a common theme in American politics is this idea, why are so many people supporting the candidate that I don't like? And there's an easy answer, and it's given a lot. It's like, because they're stupid. Because there are these things, these fundamental things that they don't know, and if only they knew these things, they'd vote like I do. Right? So that's a common theme. And the thing about this story is it's not new. At the founding, there were all kinds of debates about what people were capable of knowing. Now, granted, they were only talking about giving the vote to landed white males, but even then, there was a controversy about whether this was a good idea. Right? So John Adams, right, had a point of view which was not unusual. He said, the idea that the people can figure this out, that's the worst idea ever. They're the worst judges of their character. They're no keepers at all. They can't think or act or judge or will. And if you think about the decisions the Founding Fathers made, this was the majority decision. Right? Remember, you know why we have the Electoral College? It's to keep us from picking the president. Right? In the original Constitution, we didn't pick our senators. It's not until the early 19th century that direct election of senators happened. For the first 140 years of our history, senators were chosen by state legislatures. Right? So this idea that voters can't figure it out, that's a pretty common point of view. All right? So now here's a test. And the test is whether we're fully informed voters or not. All right? So I'm going to lay out a couple propositions, and let's see if we know them. So the first thing I want to ask you is about Congress. I'm not really going to ask you a question, but it's about Congress. So in a typical year, how many laws does Congress, the United States Congress, pass? Now last year was low, but there were still over 100. But in a typical year, let's say in the last decade for which all the data is available, Congress passed about 200 laws per year. Now, Hiroki gave me a very generous introduction. A lot of people consider me a world expert on what voters know. How many of these laws do I know? Very few. I did read the Affordable Care Act, all 927 pages, right? But most of the laws I couldn't even name, right? So we have that. Now, I live in the state of Michigan. Michigan's not atypical. In a typical year, how many laws does the state legislature of Michigan pass? Well, in the year where I was writing my book, they passed 323 laws that year, and that wasn't atypical. State legislatures like Texas or like Michigan pass between 100 and 400 laws per year. Okay? That is, the legislature passes them, the governor signs them. All these laws are binding on us. But it's not just laws. If you live in a city, there's a whole other set of laws too. But it's not just that. If you've ever read a law, laws are typically kind of vague. Right? They give a general sense of what you ought to do, but they don't tell people who work for government exactly what to do. So at the federal government, what you have to have is a rulemaking process. Right? There's a rule. There's a set of hearings where people who work for the bureaucratic agency will say, here's how we're going to implement the law that Congress passed. And usually there's public hearings and people can comment on them. And then the rules
are put in something called the Federal Register. Okay? And every word in the Federal Register has the full force of law. Now, how many rules are promulgated by the United States government in a particular year? Well, 2011, again, I had a graduate student looking through this. In 2011, which was not a typical year, over 3,500 rules were promulgated by the federal government. And there's a similar process in your state. Okay? Well, what does that mean, 35? Are they one-sentence rules, like, don't turn left on Tuesday? No, they're actually, a single page of the Federal Register this is 8.5 by 11, so picture 10 by 14. That's how big a page of the Federal Register is. Now picture 6-point font, single space, 2 columns. That's what the Federal Register actually looks like. How many pages, these 3,500 rules, how many pages of the Federal Register in 2011 would you guess these rules took up? The answer, 82,000 of them. And 2011 was not an atypical year. And the thing I want to remind you of is every single word in the Federal Register has the full force of law. We can have court cases about whether the rules are consistent with the law, but the default expectation is that the rules carry. So I want to bring it back to this idea of the fully informed voters. Now what I want to tell you is there are 2 groups of people in America. All right? The first group of people understands that they're almost completely ignorant of everything that's happening in politics. All right? And then there's a second group, and the second group is delusional about how much they know. There is no third group. All right? So that's where we are. And you might say, well, that's a bummer, right? Because there's all these things, and how do we make decisions? But what I'd ask you is, if you go on an airplane and you fly somewhere, how much do you know about that airplane? The food you eat every day. Where did it come from? Who touched it? Were dogs near it? What was the truck clean? Sorry to gross you out, but these are all relevant questions to very important decisions that we make every day, for which we don't know a lot of details, right? So the question now becomes, can we make good political decisions despite the fact that there's a lot that we don't know? And that's where things get interesting. So the answer to question 1, why are few voters fully informed? It was a trick question. No voters are fully informed. All right? So now let's move on to how much does a voter need to know? And the answer is, it depends what you're trying to do, right? So if you've ever been on a jury, right? How many people have been on a jury? Right? The judge doesn't ask you to write the law. The judge usually asks you a question to which the jury gets to say yes or no. Right? You go to an election, you don't get to say, I'm going to write in my friend Jim. You can write it in. But often there's a set of candidates and you're choosing one. Our choices are usually pretty simple. Now, if you're a legislator, of course, you got to write laws and then you got to know a lot more. If you work for the government, you got to know a lot more. But for a lot of us, many of the decisions we make are pretty simple. That is, we have a small number of choices. So let's think about the answer a different way. Sometimes you might say, what should I know? Let's talk about a different subject. What should I eat? What's the optimal diet for a person? So there are some guidelines, but the guidelines have changed over the years. There used to be the food pyramid when I was a kid, but the food pyramid's passé now, right? There is no longer a single food pyramid, and the reason is because different people have different needs depending on what they're doing in their stage of life. So for example, marathon runners, they need a particular diet. You're going to run 26 miles, right? You better have food that has some carbs in it, a lot of water content, things like that to get you through it. The diet that you need as a marathon runner is a little different than the diet you need as a weightlifter. Weightlifter's more meat-based, right? More protein, right? There's all these, I don't know all the words, but to get, make sure your muscles are working the way you want them to. So that's one thing. Now say you're a politician like the mayor of London, right? And he needs a different diet. He's got to listen to people all day and go out and talk. He probably needs a lot of coffee. Right? But that's it, the marathon runners, they don't really want any coffee, but the mayor does. And then there's a baby, right? And babies need to eat too, but one thing about babies is they don't have teeth. So a lot of the food that we would want to eat, they can eat. So there's no single answer to what should I eat for them because it depends on their circumstance and what they're trying to do. And the same is true in politics, right? There is no one small set of facts that will allow you to do all the things you want to do. And you know this, right? Because if you're voting for president, there might be a set of things you're really concerned about. But if you go and vote for mayor, right, the information that helped you with president might not help you with mayor. So how do we figure this out? Right. So let's ask, what are the types of things that people are trying to do when they vote? And a common thing that people are trying to do is make a choice that's consistent with moral or ethical values. So sometimes people say, boy, if we just got rid of politics, everything would be better. The problem is, you can't do it. Because politics is like this basin. So you think about all the interactions we have in society, and there's some that we just solve just by trying to be nice to other people. There's stuff that we don't disagree about, we just do. And then there's other stuff that we don't really agree on. And that's what you need in politics. That's why you need law. It's like, when can you take something from somebody? When can you cross the street? When can you go fast in a car? And things of that nature. So politics is really about the conflict of values. So here's an example. In the mid-19th century in America, one of the most contested political issues was child labor. It was a big contested political issue. There were large societal forces in America that said you should bring kids to factories. Now, if you can't imagine that, I grew up on a farm again. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, most of the American economy was agrarian. Most families lived on farms, family farms. And kids can work on farms. I did it. Kids can move dirt around, kids can carry water, kids can pull stuff out of the ground, kids can work on farms, right? I did it, a lot of people do it. So, in the mid-19th century, it's very common. Kids contributed to a family economy. So now the economy changes, families move to cities, and we're going to factories. And there's part of our cultural heritage that's saying, well, of course the kids should go to the factory with dad, because that's part of what we do. And there's another segment saying, I don't think that's a good idea. Don't like the idea of kids in factories, it's not safe, they could be manipulated, they don't really have the judgment to make this decision on their own. So it's a big political debate, one of the biggest political debates of the later part of the 19th century, even the early 20th century. But now today, there is no candidate, not the 17 on the Republican side, not the others on the Democratic side. I have a great idea for growing the economy. 8-year-olds, $1 an hour factories, right? Any one of them would be kicked off the continent, right, for saying that. Despite the fact that factories today are so much safer than they were 150 years ago, no one would ever say that. Why? Because children not working in factories in the US became a moral issue. It's the basis of a moral and values-based consensus. It's no longer a political issue. But it's not because the issue became somehow automatically less, it's because we came to a values consensus. So when people make political choices today, the issues that we call political today, they're the ones where we don't have the values consensus. So lots of people are trying to figure this out. How do I make a decision that's consistent with my belief about myself, or my family, or my community, or my faith, or my view of the country? That's what people are trying to do. Okay? So they want to make these choices effectively or efficiently. Some people are really into politics and they spend all day on it. Some people can't, right? Some people, to try and make ends meet, to take care of themselves, take care of their families, takes all their energy. And to have, we're at a university and we have kind of great discussions of, or we can watch CNN, we have time to do it. Some people don't. And then for other people, there's CNN and cat videos, or ESPN and cat videos, and they don't want to watch. So, there are a lot of people who want to take care of it quickly. We can talk about the morals or ethics of that, but that's where we are. So people want to make decisions consistent with their morals and values. They want to do it effectively, and the value of information depends on your role, right? If you're just casting a vote and there are two candidates, there's a certain set of things you want to know. So the example I used this morning is every morning the president gets a national security briefing every morning. Here's some updates on security situations, right? Really critical for what the president has to do. Now, for you and me, it'd be really cool to get that. We couldn't do anything with it, right? Whereas the stuff that we really need to know today or tomorrow, you gave it to the president. He's like, why is this on my desk, right? The information that's critical, so information has different value to different people depending on what you're trying to do. So what are the kinds of information that we might need, right? So we'll move to how much does a voter need to know. So the first thing I'll say is that a lot of the choices that we make as citizens are what we call binary choices. That is, you have two alternatives, this one or that one. So I mentioned I'm bilingual. To the extent that I offend any of you with anything I say politically, if you support a major party, my goal is to do it evenly. And if you support a minor party, I can't help you. So let's assume in the presidential election, there are really only two candidates that can win. I'm not making this up. I'm just talking about every available poll. All right. There's 2 candidates that have a shot at winning. And this is also true for most of your state and local elections. So that's like you get to choose one of 2 things. So that's very common. In primaries, you have a little more, but in general elections, there are 2 candidates that historically have any chance of winning. Or if you're on a jury, most of the time the judge tells you yes or no. They don't say, oh, now you get up and give us your opinion. That's not how juries work. All right? So binary choices. So if you think about a binary choice, how hard is it to choose the right one out of 2 options? So I'll bring a friend in here. Here's my friend. And my friend here, if we gave him a coin and there was a right answer, a right vote to cast, he could get the right answer 50% of the time just by flipping a coin. Comes up heads, he votes for candidate A, votes for B, he comes up with candidate B. All right. Now in baseball, 50%, that's pretty good, right? But in politics, we want people to get like 100%, right? We want, if there's a right choice, we want them to get it all the time, right? And so the question is, could we get somebody like a chimp with a coin to make a decision that was right almost 100% of the time? And the fact is we can. So suppose, here's a thought experiment. We're going to give this chimp a coin that gives him the right answer to a question 51% of the time, right? So let's say there's a right vote for the chimp to cast. It's whatever's right for all of us. Suppose there's something that's right for all of us, or that's better for all of us in the aggregate. We're going to give this chimp a coin. He's going to flip it, and 51% of the time, it's going to give him the right answer for us. All right? Now the question is, what happens if you use majority rule as we do in elections, and you have lots of chimps as we do in elections? What happens if you have lots of chimps that flip coins that are right 51% of the time? Right? Because you can ask yourself, is the average voter less competent than one of these chimps? So let's look at this. If you have one chimp, they get the right answer 51% of the time. If you have 300 chimps and they all flip the coin once, and the coin gives them the right answer 51% of the time, the probability that a majority gets the right answer is 61%. It's basic statistics. There's no magic here. But if you have an electorate of 1 million or 10 million, as we have in many cities or states, and all the chimps have a 51% chance of getting the right answer, the probability that a majority gets the right answer is nearly 100%. This is statistics. It's not magic. So if we think that majorities of voters get things wrong, what we have to believe is that on average, they're less competent than a chimp with a 51% coin, right? Which is possible, right? Because unlike the chimps, there might be a bunch of us that are sort of swayed by the light, and we'll all make the same kind of error, which would throw off the statistics. If we all kind of had groupthink and we all made the same mistake. But for a binary choice, when you have 2 alternatives, make it, again, flipping a coin gets you the right answer half the time, and if your coin is a little bit more likely to be right than wrong, then bunches of you get the right answer most of the time, right? There's no magic here. But now I'll show you a little bit of magic. Because you might say, well, but what is the type of thing that I need to know to perform at the level of a 51% chimp, or better, okay? So I'm going to say we do things like this pretty regularly. So here's a traffic intersection, okay? So this has, looks like 9 lanes here, 7 or 8 lanes over there. At rush hour, before a football game or a busy time, you have 150 or 200 cars at that intersection. And the engineering problem that we have to solve is how do we get all these cars through that intersection within 90 seconds. As an engineering problem, it's really, really hard because we have 150 to 200 independent units. And we want to think about what's their speed potential, what's their acceleration potential, when is the person in front of me going to press the accelerator, when are they going to press the brake, what about the person two cars in front of them, what about the person behind me. As an engineering problem, it's really complicated. If we tried to devise a computer program to sort of characterize this whole situation, it would be really complicated. But of course, we don't do that. And the reason we don't do this is we have built a device that helps us solve this problem. So we call it a queue. It's one way. We've built this queue. And what I mean, a piece of practical information that is sufficient for us to solve what would otherwise be a complex problem. In driving, that's our queue. We don't think about the engineering problem. We have a cell phone in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other hand, and we watch for the light to be red or green, and we press the car in front of us, and we press the accelerator, and we get this right almost 100% of the time, even in Southern California, right? So it's a pretty remarkable thing. And so now let's think about politics. We're like, boy, if only we had something in politics that worked like a traffic light. But we do. in a lot of elections, we have these party labels, right? And not for all voters, but for a lot of voters, they understand enough about the difference between what these two symbols mean that when they see two candidates and one's affiliated with one and one's affiliated with the other, they feel like they know something, right? They use it like a brand name, right? And we use brand names all the time, right? You have an Apple this and a Starbucks that and a Ford or a GM or whatever it is that. We use these brand names to try and make inferences about these products that, let's be honest, we really know nothing about, right? We just know that they work, right? Except for the ones that catch on fire, right? So we don't buy those anymore, right? But so in politics, for a lot of people, Democrat and Republicans like stop and go. And when you interview people and you ask them about the choices they're making in elections, and you ask them about these choices not just during the election, but after the election or years later, people are like, yeah, I made the right choice. I didn't know a lot, but I'm happy with the choice I made. It's not entire, and when you regret a choice, it's really painful. But for so many Americans, that's how this works. So that because, the criterion for making a good choice as a community is to be smarter than chimp with a 51% coin, and you have these traffic lights, a lot of people figure it out. Not everybody, it's not a fail-safe. And there are some issues that are really complicated where you need more than a traffic light. But there are a lot of issues where the traffic light works for us. So how much does a voter need to know? Kind of depends on what you're trying to do. But we have built some devices that help us. Okay? But let's say, all right, but I'm still concerned. And I'm in the civic education field, so I'm very concerned. So suppose there are things you want people to know so they can improve their own quality of life or that of their families or their communities or their nations. How do we go about it? So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about how voters learn. Okay? So here's our friend again, and we're going to talk about if we wanted her to know something to inform her vote or her citizenship, how would we get her from where she is now to where we want her to be? So first what I'm going to do is show you a picture of how this might work. So there might be this thing called truth, and you might watch truth, and it might come into your brain and stay there, and that's how we learn. And so if you remember nothing else about this talk, the one thing I want to alert you to is that is so not how learning works. That is so far from how learning works. It can't work that way. The way that learning works is very different. And our brains play tricks on us to make us think that we're more cognizant of some things that we actually are. So I'm going to peel the lid off this a little bit so we can see how it works. Right? So here's the first thing. These are brain cells. They are the physical basis of everything we believe, of everything we feel, and of everything we remember. If learning is going to occur, what we need is someone to be so focused on an object or an idea that adrenaline flows, that it causes blood flow to go upstairs, and it causes changes in physical relationships between these objects. That's what learning is. Okay, this is the only talk about brain cells we're going to have right now, although I'll be happy to answer more questions in the Q&A, along with the math questions. All right? But how do we make that happen? Attention is the whole thing. Attention is the bottleneck. How do you get somebody's attention to pay attention? And it turns out to be really hard, right? So our brains were built to deal with that. We're really good at that. Seeing contrast, seeing sharp things, hearing danger, smelling food, right? If a roast beef cart were to go in the back room now, I'm toast. Because you can't help but smell it, and it takes away some of your attention, right? So our brains are built for this. The problem is, as our society has evolved, our expectations have raced ahead faster than our brains have. And it's no offense, it's all of us, my brain too, okay? So, we started inventing these devices to help us communicate more effectively. So this is a teletype. And the awesome thing about this is the first device that allows you to communicate in almost real time with someone who you can't see, with someone who's not in the same space as you. It's an amazing device. And if you're under 30, another way to explain this is from here to here is about 140 characters. That's the first Twitter. That's the Twitter prototype right there. It's really short, really kind of simple sentences. But the problem is we invented printing presses and telephones. We invented typewriters, right? We invented Xerox machines. And the text got longer and longer. And then we made radio and television. And the stimulus got more and more complex, right? So the problem is our brains stayed kind of constant. So there's an estimate that comes from psychology about the capacity of your attention. And one way to think about this is the number 7 plus or minus 2. It's the number of things you can think about at a single moment. Okay? Now, what's the currency here? So I'm going to introduce the actual technical term from this research. It's called a chunk. So there are 7 plus or minus 2 chunks, and a chunk is something you can think about without thinking about it. So if I say the word dope walker, if I say dope walker, right? For some people, a whole bunch of images have just come up. A whole bunch of narratives have just come up. And other people have said, is that even a name? Or is that something I use when I break my knee? Right? Is that, like I have the dope walker. It helps me on hills. Right? So it's so if you know a lot about dope walker, it's one chunk. It all comes back, and you don't have to put any effort into it. But if you wanted to learn about dope walker, it would take, here's another way to explain it. Chess. So suppose we have a chess board, and you have a chess master and a chess novice, and they both approach the board. The chess master can look at the board and see their first 5 moves in one chunk. They just see it. They see how it's going to work. The chess novice walks up to the board and says, oh, a horse. Wow, 2 horses on a chessboard. Wow. Wow. What next? Right? And for them to build a move, they have to use multiple chunks to try and figure it out. So the difference between an expert and novice is not the number of chunks, it's how much you can think about and remember without effort. So when you're trying to talk to somebody about politics, there are only 7 plus or minus 2 parking spaces. And some of the parking spaces could be taken up by, oh, look at the sun. Oh, there might be food over there. Oh, 5 seconds ago he said something that I'm still thinking about. We're always competing with that. What the plus or minus 2 is, it has to do with adrenaline. So I'm going to say something unfortunate. There are 2 experiences I've had in my life when I'm pretty sure I've been at 7 plus 2. One is I've been in a car accident and everything's moving slowly. Right? And the other is I'm not very good at sports, but a couple times I'm playing ice hockey and the net looks like this. Like you're just up there and I can't even miss this. Like not even I can miss this. Like most of the time it doesn't happen. Most of the time net looks like that. So that means your attention channel is really, so that's like, if you've had those experiences. The 7 minus 2 is like I go home after a long day of work. I got the remote in my hand, I'm watching something on TV, and my spouse comes in the room, and I know she's saying something to me, but I can't quite make out what it is. Because now it's at 7 minus 2. So nature doesn't change the rules on this one. So if you have something really important you want to say to somebody, you've got to break through and get their attention. You've got to get a couple of these parking spots. And if you're trying to say something complicated, you got to get 3 or 4 of the parking spaces so they can think about it together. And you've got to present it in such a way that they want to think about those things as opposed to all the other things they could think about, like everything that's on those devices. So I have colleagues, and I may have some people here that do not allow smartphones in their classroom because of what obviously will happen, like watch sports and cartoons and whatever. I teach persuasion, so I feel like I don't get to do that. Like if I can't beat that device, the problem's me, right? But the issue with these things is there's so much you could pay attention to, and it's always in the room. Now, you might think, oh, this is a terrible thing, but the fact is, even before we had cell phones, people had the capacity to pretend they were paying attention to you and think about something else. So that's called being polite. But it really isn't, right? But now you can see it. You can walk around a room and say, hey, I thought you were listening to me. Why are you checking the score of the Rangers game? Like, they were checking the score of the Rangers game a generation ago. They didn't have the internet. They were thinking about it, trying to figure out how to do it, right? That's cat video, right? People love cat videos, and the point is, there are always things that we're competing with when we're trying to get somebody's attention. So that's the rule. Nature doesn't change that rule for us. So now the question is, if we're trying to teach somebody something, how do we get one of these parking spaces, right? So the thing to understand, particularly in the modern era, is the communicative space is more competitive than it has ever been. We're competing with, the media companies have gotten a lot better at putting things in your smartphones that are addictive, right? There are so many people now who can give political opinions, and they all have access to the internet. And if you want to talk to somebody about politics, you're competing with all of those and everybody who's posting on Facebook and Twitter and things like that. That's our reality. So how do you break through? Right? And there's a couple simple rules. The same biology that I just told you about gives you some ideas about how it is people pay attention. Okay? So, urgent, simple, and direct. That's your key. So, I'm in a room right now, we're having a conversation, except it's just me doing all the talking, it's kind of a weird conversation. But I'm trying to be effective, and I don't know how it works, because I don't know a lot of you. But what I try to think about is, why are you in this room? When I walk into a room with people, my objective isn't, I'm going to tell my story, I'm going to sell whatever I'm selling, because you don't care about that. It's, why are you in this room at that moment? And can I find something about which you're passionate? Can I find something about which you're anxious? And can I lay out a couple pieces of birdseed so you're like, I think I see a path to get something I want. I think I see a way to accomplish something I want. Right? That's how I think about things. Urgent, simple, and direct. Now, you might say, well, in mathematics, we have to have all these complicated ideas. This isn't going to work. If you can't get people to pay attention to your first sentence in the math lecture, the 10th and 11th sentence don't matter much. So you've got to get this. And when you're competing with all the other stimuli, urgent, that is not urgent to me, but urgent to you. Can I find something that is urgent to you? Make the initial pitch simple. Here is something that can change your life, improve your life, and direct. It's about you. I am more likely to get your attention. If I fail at any one of these three things, the cat videos win. Okay? If I hit all these three things, I have a shot. That's how it works now. Except there's one exception, and that's at universities, where we have these things called captive audiences, right? So we have students, and they are reliant on us for grades and letters of recommendation, and even if we're horrible and boring, they kind of have to sit through it, right? But when we leave the sanctity of the university, the world's a little different, right? So, urgent, simple, and direct. This is a strategy, and what has been happening in the world, both in politics, in commerce, right, in religion, people who understand this are gaining new audiences, are finding ways to compete. And people who are very intellectual like myself and say, oh, no, that's terrible. We need to go back to the old way where people were obligated to pay attention to me, even if I was horrible. That world's gone. The internet killed it, right? Except at universities. Right? So we think about Brexit. Brexit, to me, is a case study in how not to run a campaign. Okay? And this is something I was talking about during the campaign. I didn't know the polling, but they made a couple critical errors. So we can talk later about whether claims that were made in the Brexit campaign were accurate or not, and many were inaccurate. But one of the claims made about what would happen if the UK left the European Union is that the money would come back and we're going to put it into the National Health Service. They have national health care there. So we're just going to take that £350 million and we're going to improve your health care. Easy, right? People can eat that. People can feel it, and it resonated, right? What was the Remain side saying? What does that even mean? And can I eat it? If my family lives in Brighton, right, or one of the mill towns, and we've been working in this factory for 100 years, and now the factory is gone, it's moved to Portugal, it's moved to Indonesia, and it's not coming back, right? You might say, well, if we lower trade barriers, in the long run, it's better for everyone. I have a background in economics, I know the argument. But to the person who's lost their lifestyle and that's not coming back, this doesn't help them, right? So these are the types of mistakes that were made by the Remain side. But let me show you a more simple one, that they didn't understand the importance of urgent, simple, and direct, okay? Brexit. The term Brexit itself. The Remain side should never have used this word in a sentence, because it's like the easy button. Oh, Brexit, I just press the button and I get money for healthcare. What could be better? It's a simple, novel word that is memorable, right? Once you say, I know what that means. Now people talk about Texit. Even though it doesn't exist yet, you all know what I might be talking about, right? So it makes it seem so simple. Now, here's what you could have done. Every time the Remain side talked about the other side, they could have used a 19-word phrase that said, the consequence of trying to extricate ourselves from the European Union with lots of unknown consequences and years of negotiations. And with a British accent, it sounds better. But they could have said that. They could have used that term every time to send the signal that voting to leave will lead to an incredibly complicated process. That is a strategic decision that you could have made. But by the Remain side, using the term Brexit, they fed into the narrative that it's simple. It's an easy button. We get rid of the immigrants too. Bonus. Right? a tactical mistake. We can talk more about Brexit, but this is just, there's some fundamental errors made in that campaign, right? So they helped leave. Every time the Remain side used this word, which they didn't have to use, they helped the Leave side, right? This is really basic errors. So we can talk more about this. So before I make things better, I'm going to make things better in a moment. I'm going to make things a little worse. So let me tell you a couple other things about how we learn. First, we are so easily distracted. Like, we could be in the middle of an academic lecture, and then something like totally unrelated to the terms. You don't have to pick it up. Something like, I throw that pen, and you can't help but see it and wonder why it traveled that way. We're so easily distracted, right? So that's number one. And pens are pretty cheap. Okay. Next, we love quick and simple explanations. We love them, particularly in politics. Why are people voting for the other side? Because they're idiots. Done. And the nice thing in politics, if you get to say that everybody on the other side's an idiot, not only does it make you feel good, it can absolve you of having to explain your own point of view. Well, I don't have to defend my point of view because they're stupid, right? And we've all been in that conversation. So it's a strategic move, right? And we love that. The reason that we have higher education is to try and break this habit, right? To try and think, oh, wait a minute, wishful thinking isn't all it's cracked up to be. Maybe sometimes we want to understand cause and effect and multiple reasons for things, right? But we love quick and simple explanations. Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a great book if you haven't read it, but it talks about how we do this. The last thing, my background's in mathematics, and there was a time when I believed that we learned very rationally through mathematical rules. And then I started collecting data and running experiments, and that belief went downhill really quickly. Right? There are some rules, but they're not the slick ones. We often evaluate information based on how it makes us feel. If somebody gives us information that's really threatening, we don't think about it, we try and back away from it. So if you're a liberal and you watch Fox News, like, probably what you're not doing is like, well, today I'm going to be really open-minded about Bill O'Reilly, and I'm actually going to think about what parts of his argument make sense. Most of the time the reaction is, ew, where's the remote? And if you're a conservative, you've had that experience with Rachel Maddow, right? So it's that. So it's not trying to think through what can I learn today. It's getting you away from the threatening thing. And similarly, if somebody is like saying something nice about the candidate you like, it's like, I love you. Give me more, right? Come closer, right? And so we react in. So these are basic things. They're always in the room, right? So it leads to a phenomenon that I call, I'll see it when I believe it. And it's pretty common. So let me show you an extreme example. Climate change. Why do people disagree about climate change? So this is a recent study by Dan Kahan at Yale. And so what we have here is a scale. So what Kahan did is measured people's general science knowledge. And so here's the scale. And it's just sort of showing you that the more questions people could answer correctly on his quiz, it was correlated with this science intelligence measure that he had. That's great. Now what I'm going to show you is how science intelligence correlates with belief in the following statement. Is the Earth getting warmer mostly because of human activity, right? Or mostly because of natural patterns? So I'm going to show you support for the idea that it's mostly human activity. So how do you think this is going to play out? Well, for a lot of people, they say, oh, I know how this is going to be. The smart people understand that it's mostly human activity, and it's the stupid people who think that's not what's going on. So what we have here are people. So this is how much you know about science. High here, low here. And here's how you're answering the question. So the people most likely to endorse this statement are people who know a lot about science and identify as a liberal Democrat. The people who are least likely to endorse this statement are people who know a lot about science but identify as a conservative Republican. Right? So what's going on here? The debate about climate science isn't all about science. Some of it's about values, right? We could agree on the science, but then there's the question of how much of, if any, of our current lifestyle should we change or sacrifice for potentially uncertain changes in the life of others who we don't understand, who live in the future, who may live far away. And because what we talk about in politics, there's no politics of climate change where the facts and the values are locked in separate rooms. They're together. And so when people are answering questions like this, they're not, you might think you're asking a science question, but they understand that you're asking a science question that's kind of loaded politically, and these are the answers you get over and over again, right? So I'll see it when I believe it. I'll accept what you're saying once I understand that your values are consistent with mine. Because if I see you as having threatening values to me, that's a problem, and I start to back away, right? I once met with the head of the Southern Baptist Convention. I also had the head of the Evangelical Association, where I was at a thing where they were there, and one of them asked me, well, how would you write a sermon on climate change? I said, well, I wouldn't. Well, first of all, I grew up on a farm, so like, why are you even asking me this stuff? But and I said I wouldn't because your congregation doesn't view you as an expert on science. But do you have a sermon, this is like 10 years ago, do you have a sermon that you give every year on stewardship of God's creations? On the responsibility of this faith to look over everything that God has created? Do you have a sermon that you give every year that when you have that, people go to the apex with you? You feel the energy, and when you're about to deliver the key line, you know that everybody's with you. Give that speech, remind everybody of their shared values, and then right at the end, when you're about to talk about what our responsibilities are, remind us that the environment is one of God's creations. And protecting the environment is consistent with what we already believe and who we are. If you want to give a sermon about climate change and you present yourself, today I'm a scientist, people say, no, you're my pastor, right? But if it's like, no, today I'm your pastor and we're going to talk about our shared values, and this is an implication, that's a way to extend the coalition. It's urgent, it's simple, it's direct, and it's consistent with values such that people will want to see it. Because in competitive environments, the way to expand a political coalition, and really the only way that biology allows, right, is first you have to get people's attention, and then we have to talk to common values. Because if you're threatening my values or I'm threatening yours, I can't hear you. I choose not to hear you. There are some cases where maybe, I see that the train is coming, you tell me the train's coming, and I step out of the way. But if neither of us can see the train, neither of us can see the immediate threat, and you're telling me I need to change what I'm doing, right? The question is, why do I believe you? Particularly when I can watch cat videos that make me feel really good, right? So that's politics today. We have competition, we have values, and if you want to speak to people who aren't like you, and you don't have to want to do that, right? We have to find the place where our values intersect and not hit the other person over the head because they believe something differently than we do. If you want to hit somebody over the head, that's fine. It's just not going to build your coalition. So, how do voters learn? They often seek simple cues that help them relate choices to their values. Okay? I've cut the math part out, but that's the basic idea. So I want to talk about one more question, and that's, should I be cynical? Because this campaign's been hard fought. There's a lot of stuff going on. So let me walk you through why the 2016 campaign, just a couple ideas of why it's taken on the tenor that it has. Okay? So we have this gentleman again. We have this person. And, there's some stuff going on now. All right? So why is that? So I want to remind you about a couple things about campaign. First, I'm going to tell you a secret about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Okay? The secret is that they agree on almost everything. Yeah, how could that be? They agree because what an election is about is they're trying to focus on the issues where they disagree. They agree on the sanctity of the Constitution, with the possible exception of one amendment. Right? They agree on the general role of the armed forces, with some exceptions about where deployment is and how they last, but the general role of the armed forces. About the role of markets in the economy. Are there important disagreements? Yes. But is there a lot of agreement? There is. I know you can't watch TV and see that, but we'll get to TV in a moment. They focus on the issue, elections focus on where we have value divergence. We don't talk about how awesome it is that we don't have children working in factories. Right? We could celebrate like how it's awesome, but we don't even talk about it. Because candidates have incentives to draw attention to their differences. That's what the campaign's about. I want you to vote for me rather than the other one because of this difference. Similarities, why that doesn't give you a reason to vote for me. So this is the strategy in election, and then there's the media. Boy, and by the media I mean us. The media loves conflict, right? We like to watch football, Not because the sides say, hey, today, let's not try and score on each other. Let's just toss the ball back and forth and hold hands, right? Like, you could do that on a football field. You could still have the pretty uniforms, you could still have the marching bands. Like, no one wants to watch that, right? There are all kinds of things where we want to watch the competition. The reason that all the major media networks have shows that accentuate the conflict is because we like to watch it. We love this, right? When people are getting along, we talk about this Congress, the Congress now, right? We say how divisive it is. Do you know that this Congress, which people call the Do-Nothing Congress, passed 108 laws last year? It passed, this Congress and the President signed 108 laws last year. Is it lower than historical average? Yes. But 108 is not zero. And they were not all about insignificant things. And how many times, I love Anderson Cooper's Suits, but how much of this did you see on the Anderson Cooper show? You never saw it. Because more people will watch the Anderson Cooper show, right, if you have the Trump supporter and the Clinton supporter kind of going at each other for an hour. Right? All right, so, should I be cynical? Here's the thing about elections in government, and this is something I've learned over my life. I get to talk to people in government. I've worked with the armed forces. I've helped them develop strategies and understanding about small group behavior. And there are servicemen and women out there that are putting their lives on the line. And there are people who are making decisions about where they're going to be deployed. And they're busting their butts trying to do the best they can. There are people who work in hospitals, both private-funded and public-funded hospitals. Most hospitals, as you know, are actually a mix. And they work for the government, and they're trying to figure out how to improve quality of life. There are school teachers who work for public schools at all different levels, or private schools that have a lot of public funding. And they're trying to figure out how to make life better for their communities. And then, we look at the nation, but if you think about all the states and cities and towns and counties where there are people working to try and improve life for their communities. And then you look at what actually, so these are people who devote their lives to it, maybe many of you. And then you think about elections. And in a lot of these elections, you have people who are new to politics or relatively new, and they're going out in public and trying to articulate ways that we can live together and do things more effectively. Some of it is very divisive, and that's good on TV, and it's great for a 30-second ad. But if you listen to a lot of people who are running for office, they're trying to figure out a new way to do things, right? So politics isn't some machine. It has machine elements. Politics is people. And there's a lot of people in politics that are working really hard to make our lives better. And they don't care about party. It's the amazing thing. Like, I get to work with these folks. They don't care about party. They care about quality of life. And what the elections are about is them. The elections are about, so that's a lot of what it's about. But it doesn't get on TV, because that's what I just talked about. It's terrible television. It's really horrible to see the person in your county that helps the elderly or helps the children, and they actually are kind of doing what they're supposed to be doing. Like, that's horrible TV. And I'd rather watch, basketball, right? But if you were to take all the political activity in this country and put it into a hat and then randomly pull out a part of it, you wouldn't see what we have on TV. And this is not me. I'm not blaming anybody. It's all of us. Like, we like the conflict. But what politics is really about is people. And it's about the choices we make, right? And how we can live together. And the thing is, after every election, we have to live together, right? And so there are a lot of people trying to figure this out. So the people who are really effective in politics, they didn't know the whole brain thing that I told you. Some people just know it naturally, just like the baseball pitcher who doesn't understand anything about physics, but they figure out how to throw a wicked curveball just through practice. There are some people who understand that if I can speak to you on your own terms, if I can be sympathetic to your values, you might listen to me and we can have a conversation and learn from each other. Those are the people that really kill it in politics, right? And that's, I think, what's in it for you, particularly if you're young. Because these opportunities are out there, right? So, the answers to my 4 questions are why are so few voters fully informed? Trick question, okay? How much does a voter need to know? Depends what you're trying to do. And for some tasks, cues are available, right? How do voters learn? Looking for simple ways to connect things to your values. And then, should I be cynical? That answer is ultimately up to you if you're young. But the thing to understand is politics is people. You can be involved in it. You can't determine who's president, but you can affect what happens on this campus. You can affect what happens in this town. You can affect what happens in a community that you don't currently live in but could help. And your ability to reach out to people and communicate with them effectively can give you a lot of leverage and a lot of ability to improve people's lives. And that's ultimately what justifies politics. That's what makes it worthwhile, right? And all of you can be part of it, right? These are tools that can help you do it. But whether you want, there's some ugly stuff too. But whether you want to be part of it or not is up to you. You can make it better. It's not beyond any person in this room to do that today or tomorrow. So that's my story. I wrote a book and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Matthew Wilson, to kick off the discussion. So I'd like to invite Matthew to the chair, and he will kick off the discussion. So from this very straightforward and provocative discussion.
Okay. Use the mic? Okay. Sure, I can use the microphone. I'm going to start by just offering a few thoughts and reflections on what Professor Lupia said, and then we can have a discussion. I'd like to hear his thoughts. And Skip, as you were presenting the idea that effective political messaging requires a message that is urgent and simple in order to break through the fog of distraction and confusion. What strikes me about that is that urgent and simple is not generally the recipe for high quality deliberation. That is, urgent, simple messages aren't usually the correct answers to problems. I'm paraphrasing here, but I've heard it said that there is no problem in the world so complex that it does not have a simple answer that is completely wrong. And those simple but completely wrong answers are easy to communicate to people with urgency, right? Simple but wrong answers can be packaged into sound bites, can be plastered on the side of a bus, can be easily exploited by propagandists. And if those are the kinds of messages that actually break through people's mental fog, garner their attention, then that seems to me a very disturbing reality in terms of what our political discourse is likely to look like. Because my sense is that the answers to most of the political problems that we face are in fact complex, nuanced, multidimensional, not entirely on one side or the other of the political spectrum. And yet, those kinds of solutions seem to be exactly the ones that you say people are least likely to pay attention to. And if that's the case, it strikes me then that you may be completely correct, but that your argument becomes a very powerful one for elitism instead of popular democracy. That is, if ordinary people can only be spoken to in messages that are urgent and simple, then that could be construed as an argument to leave the important decisions to elites, to the people who will actually tolerate and process complex messages, that will have some appreciation of nuance, that are willing to entertain arguments with complexity on both sides of an issue. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily what I'm advocating, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether, in fact, the implications of your work are in fact elitist in that sense. The other thing that struck me about the relationship between knowledge and values, which I think is a really good and important point that you made, is that when we try to describe why our political opponents believe what they believe, or why our political opponents do what they do, I think you're absolutely right that very often our answer is because they're stupid. Right? But that's not always our answer. The other possible answer is because they're evil. Sometimes that's what we say. That, oh, it's not that the people that disagree with me are dumb. The people that disagree with me just have profoundly deficient values in some way or another. We hear this very often said that, well, the reason that my opponents do what they do is just because they're racist. They're just racists. And that's a conversation stopper, right? In the same sense that saying that they do what they do because they're stupid means that I don't have to engage them. So too, if I say, well, they think what they think because they're racists, that also means I don't have to dignify their position with any kind of response. Or, you'll hear sometimes people on the right say that, oh, well, our opponents on the left advocate these economic policies because they fundamentally don't believe in American freedom. Well, again, that's kind of a conversation stopper, right? If you say they believe what they believe because they have fundamental value deficiencies, I would wonder how you see that relationship between accusing our opponents of a deficiency of knowledge versus accusing our opponents of a moral deficiency, because it seems that sometimes we employ one or the other in dismissing those arguments that we disagree with. I really like the idea of what appears to be knowledge actually being a stand-in for values, or knowledge being a way, or what appears to be knowledge being a way of projecting our value-based judgments. And what leapt to mind for me in thinking about this is the much ballyhooed statistic about how many Republicans believe that President Obama is a Muslim. Right? Now, in survey after survey, some significant number of Republicans in the United States say that they believe President Obama is a Muslim. This is often interpreted, particularly by Democrats, as evidence that Republicans are just ignorant. Okay? That lots of Republicans believe this obviously factually false thing, which just shows what we knew all along, speaking as if you were a liberal Democrat. It shows what we knew all along, that Republicans are just dumb, they're just ignorant, and so you can't reason with those people. Now, I would argue actually that a very large number of the people who say in response to surveys that President Obama is a Muslim do not in fact believe that President Obama is a Muslim. I would argue that if you ask people, is President Obama a Martian? A significant number of Republican respondents would say yes, President Obama is a Martian. Now, would that be because they genuinely believe that he comes from Mars? No. But they see that response as a way of conveying the sense that he's something different than me, right? He's something, and not necessarily in a racial sense even, but he's something different than I am in terms of his values, in terms of his worldview. And so therefore, giving that response, saying that President Obama is a Muslim, is not really a statement about my factual belief regarding his religious values. It is a way of conveying the fact that I don't like him. And so that, in that sense, what we actually know about politics from a factual sense, from a factual standpoint, and our desire to project valenced value judgments in response to political questions can get really confounded. I think that is something that's at work in the climate change data that you presented. So I think that the interaction there is really very interesting. When you talked about the idea of simple cues that are linked to values, that effective political communication is simple cues linked to values. I think that there's a lot of truth to that. What frightens me about that is that sounds like a classic recipe for demagoguery and for totalitarian propaganda, right? The propaganda artists in North Korea or Nazi Germany or Stalinist Soviet Union emphasized all the time that we need simple cues linked to values, right? That's how you build support for totalitarian regimes. Keep the political choices very simple, couch them in highly loaded value terms, and then you can persuade large numbers of people. So it seems that to the extent that that's correct, it would be heartening to totalitarians of both left and right, and discouraging to people who really want kind of deliberative, balanced, democratic reasoning. So again, I guess the question is that not a reason to be cynical, if in fact the messages that really are going to penetrate are simple cues that are linked to values? Because very often, simple cues that are linked to values are the political messages that the elites, whether professors, journalists, whoever, find most disturbing, right? If we look in this campaign, what are the messages that enrage the chattering classes that come from, for example, Donald Trump? It's when Donald Trump makes simple cues that are linked to values. But we've just heard that those are the kinds of messages that people are most likely to actually listen to. So that seems to present quite a conundrum for democracy. The final issue that I think is interesting here with regard to comparing voters to the chimp with the 51% coin is that one advantage that the chimp has, who presumably cannot understand any political communications and is just making a choice on the basis of flipping the 51% coin, is that he cannot be misled, right? The chimp cannot be deceived because he doesn't understand any of the political messages. We don't have that advantage. We can, in fact, be misled by people with specific intent to mislead, to cause us to make inaccurate choices. And I wonder to what extent you see that as systematically problematic in democracy. The fact that we've got people on both sides who are actively trying to obfuscate things, right? Who are actively trying to get us to make choices on the basis of incomplete or erroneous information. And it's certainly true that nobody has full information. Absolutely true. Nobody knows all of those 200 plus laws passed by Congress. Nobody knows all of those 3,500 rules made by the federal bureaucracy. But some people know more than others. And I'm reminded here of Walter Lippmann's famous comparison, famous statement about the coast of Bohemia, where Walter Lippmann's point was that everybody needs maps of the world, right? None of us can process the full, overwhelming volume of information that's out there. So all of us have to create mental maps, and maps are by their very nature simplifications of reality. But Lippmann said that the really key problem, the key challenge, is to make sure that our mental maps don't contain the coast of Bohemia. Now, Bohemia is landlocked, right? So if your map's got the coast of Bohemia on it, it's deeply problematic. But Lippmann's argument was that some people's do, right? Some people have maps that are really useful simplifications of reality that are rooted in a body of accurate information, albeit simplified and complete information. Whereas other people have mental maps that are profoundly misleading because they've got features that just aren't there. And I would just be curious to hear how you think about, reflect on that question. I'll leave it at that and hear some of your thoughts, and then we can have some discussion.
Oh, it's okay, I'll stand up, so I want to see the folks in the back too. So these are great questions. Thank you. Two of them deal with the idea of this disturbing reality, right? So the first idea of the urgent simple cues, and do they minimize things, and then the idea that they're totalitarian. So the key thing I want to point out in the phrase disturbing reality is reality. When I talk about how people process information, it's not how I want them to, and by them I mean us. It's how we make almost every decision we make on a given day. Right? Most of the decisions we make on a given day, we do automatically. When to step into the street, when to put the right left before the right. When we get a menu in a restaurant, you don't really contemplate all the choices. You just focus on 2 and 3 and make it there. So the key is a reality. When I work with organizations on messaging, here's the thing I ask them to do. This isn't about dumbing it down. This is about smartening up, about how you convey what you're doing to a broader audience. So I study how people in mathematics and physics talk to one another. And these are really technical fields. And you might say, well, right, they have different conversations than we do, right? Go to a math seminar. Go to a physics seminar. 75% of the words you won't understand. But on the other 25%, the particle physicists and the people doing quarks and leptons and the people doing advanced mathematics will have to use analogies, metaphors, and examples that are accessible, that are probably about motion, about cars or horses or things we're all familiar with, to try and make a key point, right? That's how we communicate. So people are using simplifications all the time to have ideas, and the key thing is to figure out how to do it well. So I think the reality to me is more disturbing if we don't recognize it as reality. So there are a lot of people in our position who say, no, people should think about things in different ways. They should always be deliberative. They should always take a deep breath and read all the information and so forth. I would love to live in that universe Unfortunately, there is no telescope I know of that can see anything like it, right? So now the question becomes, in the situation where we've got lots limited attention spans and lots of competition for attention, how do we make things better, right? And the way that we make things better is trying to understand how, what people can hear and then do that. I do education both on the simple points and the complicated points. But here's what I can tell you about how to get to deliberation, how to get to a deeper conversation. You either have people who already want to go deep with you, and you have to convince them. But there's other people, called students, who you do. And so what I have to do is give them I'm going to use an analogy here, a gateway drug. And the gateway drug is an app. The gateway drug is a powerful example that I might have that say, here's why something matters. So I try and find an example that's visceral, that's in their lives, it's something they're worried about. Like, wouldn't you like to know how to do that? And if you would, then stick with me for the rest of this, and now we're going to do the deep dive. Now we're going to have the conversation. But I can't get people to think about mathematics or strategy or the underlying psychology voluntarily until there's the app there saying, wouldn't you like to know how to talk to people from the other party? Wouldn't you like to know how to make things better in a community? Right? So I think most people, I believe in deliberative democracy, but I think that I have to compete with cat videos to get there. And so I have a two-step process. First, I'm going to try and give an exemplar that says, I think he has a way to help me. And then people will let me do the deep dive. But a generation ago at university, somebody like me could give a very terrible, very self-referential, very technical presentation on any topic. And if the students didn't get it, of course, it was their fault. Right? That's kind of a culture. But if you think about how learning actually works, you say, isn't there a set of analogies and metaphors and examples that you could have used that would have conveyed what you know in a way that students would understand it? We now think about that a lot more. One of the manifestations is what we call a flipped classroom, right? But again, it's an adjustment in thinking about what learning is, right? And so I'm bound in my work by, biology doesn't change the rules for me. All right, so attention. So I think that's the answer. Like I would be disturbed. I would be more disturbed by what I was talking about if I ignored it. Right? If I thought, no, people should really think about information in a different way, because it's just biology doesn't get you there. Like it can't. So I'm restrained by that. That's my life's work, is to try and help people figure out in this environment with the competition and the limitations, how do we get people to think about serious things? And so I want to have that. That's the battle I love. Right? That's the one I want to engage in. When I work with organizations, I'm like, bring it on. Right? We can't. It's like trying to change your spouse. Like it's not going to happen. Right? So you figure out, all right, how do I make this work? Right? And that's part of how it works. Let me talk about measurement now. The Obama is a Muslim thing. So every year there's a survey released, and you hear about it in the press, and it'll be 40% of Americans, 50% of Americans don't believe in evolution. And the news they have a field day with it. So myself and other people have run a bunch of surveys about this. And it turns out the answer to that question depends on how you ask it. So if you say, do you believe in evolution? A lot of people say no. All right. Do you believe that scientists believe in evolution? If you ask that question, 95% of the American public say, oh, yeah. If you ask the American public, in the theory of evolution, is it believed that, and you give the basic ideas of the theory of evolution, over 90% of Americans know what the theory of evolution is. They know the basic ideas. If you ask on climate change, do you believe that the Earth's warming because human activity? No. Do you think scientists believe that? Oh yeah. Right. So part of what's happening in a survey is not, I've run a lot of surveys. Surveys aren't normal conversations. And a lot of what people are telling you in a survey is what team they like. They're telling you what cultural team they like. Because what's at stake? You don't know the interviewer. You're having dinner and they called you and they're asking you these questions. Is Obama Muslim? Hell yes, he is. I want to get back to dinner. Right? That's a lot of what happens on surveys. Right? And so that just doesn't make surveys bad. You just got to understand what they are and what they're not. But that's a lot of what's happening in those questions. I don't know. I answered. I want to leave the time for you guys. I don't know if that's 6 seconds or 8 seconds or whatever left.
Okay, let's open the question. Anigros.
Wait for a mic. Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Nico. I'm in the anthropology department here.
Thanks, Nico.
This is, I don't know if this is a fair characterization. Part of what your talk strikes me as very postmodern. That there is no master narrative, and our perception of truth is based basically on our positionality
Yeah.
in the system.
Yeah.
Even though we have parties that pretend to have master
Yeah.
narratives about the way we should go forward. But it strikes me that in your presentation, a lot of it hinges on our positionality and what you call values within the system. So we process information. And I wonder, how are you thinking about that? Like
Yeah.
when you think values and that positionality, what is it that you have in mind in your models? And
Okay.
can that be changed rather than the messaging?
Yeah. So you're laughing because my background is in what people call rational choice theory. And so the idea, are you a postmodernist, is really, you just ask the yin to the yang I've been asked my entire life. So here's why I'm not. I'm somewhere in the middle. Here's why I'm not. I can't go full postmodern because for me to try and articulate that position, I have to assume a common grammar. And to assume a common grammar, I have to assume some non-empty intersection in the set of life experiences. Because if I want to go to full postmodern, why would I assume that I could explain to you in a language that you could understand, right? So that's why I can't get there. And it's not that I want to go. So their position, I think there's an argument for a version of positionality, which is there are commonalities in our perceptive architecture. Fire burns us all, right? There are things that we see that make us cry or want to, right? And it's not the same for everybody, but on basic things like that, they're non-empty. And that's the beginning of our shared humanity, right? And so now, in an increasingly competitive communicative environment, if I want your attention, I've got to find a link, right? I've got to find a way to relate to you. So does that make sense? So it's not the full postmodern, but positionality is a big part of it. And so now when we think about values, right? When I think, I'm defining values, so I'm following Shalom Schwartz's work in psychology, right? So he makes a technical distinction between attitudes, preferences, and values. So an attitude is an orientation towards an object. Preference is a ranking of attitudes. And a value is kind of an organizational framework for my preferences. It's like a meta-preference. The interesting thing about preferences is they're a mix of nature and nurture, and I don't know what the blend is, right? Tall people may have fear of airplanes because they have to worry about the entrance being so you hit your head, whereas a short person would never worry about that. So there's differences in physiology that would lead, but then there's common things. And as the competition for attention gets more complicated, I have to find the commonality. Otherwise, I lose. So the role of values here is, if I'm in politics and I'm trying to build a coalition with people who at time one can't hear me or don't agree with me, I have to find the values intersection. I have to try and get your attention. It's like a service orientation. To try and get your attention, I have to speak to your problem. Here's another way that I talk about it. Sometimes when people make a presentation, they think that my audience would be inherently interested in me telling my story, and I know that that's not true. What people are interested in is me telling your story. Like, I might be in it, but you need to see yourself in it. The reason we love the Shakespearean narratives, the reason we like Star Wars, the reason we like Winnie the Pooh, is not because we can see Luke Skywalker or Winnie the Pooh or Christopher Robin or one of the we see ourselves in it, and we see how they can try and deal with their tensions and achieve their goals, and we sympathize with them because we can see the commonality, right? What makes that classic literature is, I think, the idea that those narratives relate so strongly to experiences that we've all had. So now as we move into the world of political communication and commerce in the internet era, and there's all this noise and there's all this competition, there's still this basic element of how attention works, and we're all really self-centered, right? And so I think the values point is just a way for me to say, here's how to be heard. You have to tell the other person, you have to give the other person information that they want. But does that answer the question? I mean, it's very functionalist from my point of view, but I understand I get pretty far in the postmodern continuum.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, you want me to speak out loud?
If others can hear you, I'm fine with it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So, both the main candidates have significant negative,
Oh, yes.
significant negative, for different reasons. Can you explain how we got to this point where we have two candidates
Yeah.
that have such highly negative value, people view them negatively,
Yeah.
highly?
So I mean, I'll give you some correlates. I'm hesitant to say there's a reason. The thing about these two candidates that is distinctive over our lifetimes is how well known they are. These are people who have, like Hillary Clinton is arguably the most famous political woman in the country, right? And has been for the last 25 years, right? So like when John McCain or Mitt Romney or Barack Obama, right, ran for president, prior to their running for president, they weren't really that well known, you know? I mean, Obama, he gave the speech at the convention in 2004, that was nice. People in Illinois knew him, but he wasn't a national figure. Mitt Romney had some reputation from the Olympics, wasn't that well known. John McCain, a little bit, but not that, right? Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, of course, is a celebrity. He had a TV show. He's been this guy, the guy who plays a billionaire on TV for 25 years. So that's really different. So they came into the election with people knowing things about them. Now, in terms of the negatives, there are at least two things going on. One is things they've done, right? I mean, both of them are very ambitious, and they have not hesitated to ruffle feathers or to violate norms of their roles in society to achieve certain things, right? And so a lot of people have negative feelings about them. But there's another thing that's different about 2016. The number of people who can publish a political point of view that can be seen by lots of other people is so much larger than in any previous election, right? So when you and I were, high school students, we had two newspapers, 3 TV stations. I had 1 or 2 from Canada when I was up there, 1 or 2 from Mexico, and then you go to the library to get books, and that's it. And those things were expensive to produce, so the people that could get in them, very small group of people. So there were very few opinions that we had to deal with. And now anybody, right? You go on Facebook, you go on Twitter, right? And so what that means is there's all this noise, positive and negative, but the negative draws our attention. If you like one of the two candidates and somebody says something negative about your candidate, it hurts you, right? And if you hear the other candidate saying something that you can pin on them, you love it, right? The positive things are interesting too, but the negative things tend to be a little more visceral. You feel them a little more, right? Particularly because, I hope I won't offend anybody by saying this, but Hillary Clinton is not the orator that her husband or Barack Obama was, right? And so she has struggled to kind of create the emotional highs for the left that both of those folks have, right? So I think the negatives stick a little more with her. It's difficult, you can build a positive narrative around her, but it's not a made-for-TV narrative, right? And Donald Trump, Donald Trump's violating so many of the rules, just in terms of campaigns. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. There are a bunch of factors here. One of them is that they've been in the public eye. The other is we're in a new era. Like even in 2012, Twitter and Facebook wasn't what it was today. The New York Times, CNN, are trying to structure a narrative. The campaigns are trying to structure narratives. You can't really do it anymore because there's so many voices, right? So it's, I don't know if that's not the most encouraging answer, but that given what I have seen, those are contributing factors. I'm trying to stay away from single factor explanations.
We are going to overtime, but that's usually a game of overtime is very interesting.
Overtime.
And this discussion is so interesting.
Yeah.
So I'd like to take the question over there.
Hi, a few years ago, I heard an interview with 2 academics who just published a book of the shared characteristics of great democracies that collapsed, going back to the beginnings of history.
Yeah.
And I think the 2 first characteristics that they identified were gridlock, first of all, and secondarily, the collapsed inability to distinguish between fact and ideology. So would you comment on that?
So here's why I'm struggling with it. I think that those factors are always, you can't get rid of those in politics. I mean, I worked at JPL in grad school, like at JET. So like rocket science, like I hung out with rocket scientists. I did mathematics, and you know, there's a point of view that I was exposed to when I was young. It's like, you know, facts and values are different, right? But in politics, they're not. Right? I wish there was, like for my own, you know, like that there's a pile of facts over here and there's a pile of values and we evaluate them separately. I work with science organizations a lot, like with climate science. It's like, you know, if the public just knew the facts, everything would change. That's true to a point. But if you think about climate science, and you're like, okay, if we accept that the climate is warming and that it's correlated with human activity, then the question is what's next? And that becomes a moral and ethical question. And that's where values come in. And so if you think about the abortion debate, right? So some people in the abortion debate are like the sanctity of the unborn child is more important than anything. And so that structures what facts are critical for them, right? And they can tell you things about heartbeats and viability and so forth. And there are other people who say, no, the most important thing is quality of life for people who are living, in particular women in this environment. And a woman in this environment, you know, the sanctity is of their choices and their quality of life. And they'll have a set of facts. They'll have a set of facts saying, "Look, these are things you really ought to know." So in this debate, there are facts that are both sides have facts that even science could validate, right? Whether it's about lifestyle choices or about the sanctity, but values are never out of the room in that conversation, right? So, you know, in terms of democratic collapse, I mean, I think the thing, like I'm going to say that's above my pay grade. But if you lack the ability to respond to changes in your culture, that's when things get pretty bad, right? You lack the ability. So I think of, you know, the collapse of not just democratic governments, but lots of different governments. When you lose what you might call the selectorate, the people who kind of give you the leverage, then it's pretty bad. You know, I think, well, I'll stop there. So I don't know that we're on the verge of that. I mean, somebody's talked about we're in post-truth democracy, a post-factual democracy. It's certainly easier now to narrowcast and for all of us to have our own reality and to ignore others. But at the same time that that's happening, if you want to be an expert on something, the ability now is better than any previous generation. So what's true on most issues is we have a lot of people who aren't paying attention, who are in their echo chambers. But then you've got a cluster of people who can get all kinds of data and evidence, and they know more than any, like if you and I, like, or if we're people who are really interested in politics, the people now, what they can learn and how they can engage and how they can be effective blows away any other period in time, right? Just the things that you can, so what you're getting is, in a lot of topics, a small group of people who are more knowledgeable than any group has ever been in history. And then you get a large group who are like, Obama's a Muslim. And that's okay. Right, that's like where they are. But anyways, I'll stop there because professors can just go on forever.
Just one quick question about the political cues.
Yes.
It would seem that about political cues, it would seem that the current environment, the political cue of the Republican Party is not what it was.
Oh.
Is that, do you think that's a one-off thing, or do you think the parties are clearly losing their cueing?
So I've done some work on both parties, but in the Republican Party, there's something that we've known for a long time. There's a difference between the establishment Republicans and the conservatives, and it dates back to the Goldwater era, right? Where establishment Republicans are thinking about conservative values and trying to structure government around people being able to make choices that allow them to, you know, support a free market and things of that nature. But a lot of it is government involved to help markets thrive would be one example. Believing in the ability of government to incentivize people to do certain things. The movement conservative is the idea that government is the problem, right? And so what we need to do is reduce government and not have government having incentives, not having sort of, you know, thinking about old-time conservative principles. It's like, let's just get government out of the way and let things happen. That is not really reconcilable. I mean, in the cultural wars, you can see both of them against kind of the left type movement about having government intervention, trying to, the idea that skill and luck and life circumstances play such a big role in life outcomes that the government intervention needs to be more expansive. So that would be, so you could see how the movement conservatives and the establishment Republicans could unite against that, but they've been harder to reconcile And so I think that's the biggest issue in the Republican Party. And so with Donald Trump, one of the things he was able to do this time is, remember, there were 17 at the beginning. And throughout the whole primary process, he was always polling between 25 and 40% of registered Republicans. That's not everybody, it's just Republicans, even likely voter Republicans. He's never 50, right, in sort of the polls. So one of the ways that Donald Trump prevails is that if you're getting 25% of the vote and the other 16 guys are splitting down to 75, you win the early primaries, right? And so that's part of what happens. So he maintains his 25 to 40. But I'm not, so is he a one-off? The problem is you still have this division, whatever happens after the election, the movement conservatives and the establishment Republicans still have some pretty different beliefs, right? And if, so I think the reason the Republican message looked the way that it did the last 15, 20 years from, let's say, President Reagan to Mitt Romney, is because the establishment, no offense, but the establishment Republicans always won at the end over the movement conservatives. I mean, the Santorums and the Buchanan, like, they put up a fight, but the movement conservatives always won. And this time, Trump comes in, who's really not either, and he wins. But that's still out there. Right? And so after
It's
20,
much more out in the open now than it ever has.
it's much more out in the open. You know that in the postmortem of the Republican 2012 report about Latinos, that they tried to change the primary rules to make it even more likely that the establishment Republican would prevail by sort of front-loading it and making the winner. But when there was one of the untold stories of 2016 is not just the ascendance of Trump, but what made that possible was the speed and acceleration of the Governor Bush's collapse. So I've done some analyses. If Governor Bush or Senator Rubio had been able to take 10% more of the vote for another month or 6 weeks, and it's holding a lot of other things constant, which is fair, that would have been enough to deny Donald Trump the majority of delegates. So it's the speed of the collapse, because Governor Bush had $150 million of super PAC money right at the beginning. It was all lined up behind him. But the speed of that collapse, he wanted to have a deliberative debate about the issues and did not see the Trump train coming, and it ran him over. We all watched it, right? Trump emasculated him, right? I mean, right? I'm not saying that with any glee, I'm just saying that happened. So I think the Republicans still have an issue, but my sense is that unless it's a close election, like if it's a pretty, or if the Republicans, like if the outcome is really bad for the GOP, I think there'll be a further reorganization, and the establishment folks, which is where most of the money is, they'll reorganize the party rules again to try and make sure they win next time. I think that's what'll happen. But and then the Republican signal will come kind of back to the Bush 41, Bush 43, the McCain and Romney, which were pretty similar in a lot of ways.
We can keep going on for the whole night, but we have to finish here. And please join me for thanking Dr. Lupia.